Well, good evening and welcome to our study on the book of Matthew. I want to refer to our outline that I have given you, and if you're watching on the video, the outline is available at our website. I've entitled the whole book of Matthew, King Jesus Rules. That's our study of Matthew, and I've divided Matthew into three sections. The first section is the advent of the King. That's the first 4 chapters. And the advent of the King happens in 2 parts. The first part is the word advent means coming. And the first part is his coming as an infant or a baby. And that's found in chapter 1 and 2, the lineage of the King, the birthday of the King, the worship of the King, the protection of the King. But then we get to chapter 3 and 4, and that talks about Jesus coming in ministry. And he is being heralded by John the Baptist, and is being tempted and baptized. Then we get to what I call the mission of the King. And again, the mission of the King falls into 2 parts. The mission that Jesus did in Galilee and the mission that Jesus did in Judea. So the mission in Galilee falls into a cycle. And it starts with telling us what Jesus did, and then it tells us what Jesus taught. So we have the ministry of the King when Jesus began his ministry, and then we have the ministry of the King followed by the Sermon on the Mount. Then we have the authority of the King, where Jesus demonstrates his authority by doing miracles, and that is followed by mission instructions. The whole of chapter 10 is mission instructions when Jesus is giving his 12 disciples instructions to go out in their area. Now we have come to the 3rd section of Jesus' mission in Galilee. So we have already seen the mission of the King, or the ministry of the King, and the authority of the King. Now we come to what I call the confrontation of the King, where Jesus comes into conflict with various people. And that starts in chapter 11, verse 1, and continues to the end of chapter 13. And in chapter 13, we have the 3rd major teaching and preaching section, where you have the kingdom parables. So that's where we are in the major section 2, the mission of the King, A, in Galilee, and then we're starting number 3, the confrontation of the King. That's just kind of an introduction where we've come to in the book of Matthew. Chapter 11, verse 1 is what I would call a transition verse. And ladies, there's Miriam, you could pick up those outlines and give one to Betty, please. We have verse 11, chapter 11, verse 1, let me say that right. We have a transition verse, and I want to read it for you, just independently. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. Now, I want you to know that this is a very special statement, because we've heard this kind of a statement before. If you go back in Matthew to chapter 7, verse 28, we come to the end of the first major sermon in Matthew, and right after the first major sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 7, verse 28, Matthew writes, "When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, after each one of the 5 major sermons or teachings, you have this statement, Jesus had finished teaching or saying these things. So you see it in chapter 7, verse 28, and it's repeated in chapter 11, verse 1. Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples. So this is a transition sentence, and what is new about this transition sentence? Jesus went on to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. That's why I say under the mission of the King that these are all done, all this work and teaching is done in Galilee. And that's as opposed to in Judea, which is in the south, which is going to come later on in the story that Matthew tells. So Jesus, in chapter 10, has just warned his disciples to expect hardship. I think we have a problem in the United States, and that is that we have some preachers on TV who tell you that if your life is not going well, if you don't have money, if you don't have success, if you don't have everything going right for you, you're not living for the Lord. There are people on TV saying that. And that is the opposite of what Jesus said. Jesus says, if you follow me, you can expect hardship. I'm not excited about that. I'm not saying, yay, I love hardship. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying to be realistic, if you want to follow Jesus, you can expect hardship. And Jesus told his disciples that in chapter 10. And now as we move into chapter 11 and 12, we're going to hear stories of confrontation and of hardship in the lives of Jesus and the disciples. The first hardship that Matthew tells us about is the hardship of confronting doubt. Have you ever wrestled with doubt? Even as a believer? Well, you are in good company, because John the Baptist wrestled with doubts about Jesus when he was in prison. Since John was in prison and not able to see Jesus, he sent some of his followers, his disciples, to go and see Jesus. And Jesus responded to John's questions with both firmness and with compassion. So with that kind of an introduction, I want to read for you the first 19 verses of Matthew chapter 11. After Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else?" Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." As John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No. Those who wear fine clothes are in kings' palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one of whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been subject to violence, and the violent people have been raiding it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. Whoever has ears, let them hear. To what can I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling out to others. We played the pipe for you, and you did not dance. We sang a dirge, and you did not mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say he is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by her deeds. Let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for your word. And as we look into your word and try to understand it, we ask that you would help us. And that you would help us not only to understand it, but to apply it to our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. The first part of this passage that I want us to look at is verses 2 to 6. Jesus spoke to John through his disciples, John the Baptist, that is. John had questions for Jesus, and John had sent his disciples to Jesus to ask him these questions. Look at verses 2 and 3. Consider the context. John was in prison. Even if this passage had not said that, we found out that John was in prison back in chapter 4, verse 12. John was in prison, and we're going to find out later why. He's going to tell us that in chapter 14. But so far, all we know is that John was in prison. John had heard about the deeds of the Messiah. He had heard reports about what Jesus was doing and what Jesus was teaching. But there was something nagging at John. And that was the fact, if Jesus was really the Messiah, if Jesus was really bringing in the new kingdom of heaven, then why didn't Jesus rescue John from prison? Have you ever felt down? Have you ever felt discouraged? Have you ever felt that Jesus somehow isn't answering your prayers and isn't concerned about the difficult time that you are going through? That's how John felt. If Jesus is the Messiah, and if I was the prophet to announce the coming of the Messiah, and I got put in prison, how come Jesus isn't using some of his miraculous powers to get me out of here? And you know what? Jesus didn't answer that question. Jesus went on to say something else. So John had heard about the deeds of the Messiah, and John had sent his disciples to ask this question: are you the one? Are you really the Messiah who is to come? Or should we expect somebody else? Now Jesus had the reply for John's disciples. He told them in verse 4 to report what they had heard and seen. What had they heard and seen? Well, verse 5 tells us what they have heard and seen. The blind receive sight. That is something that Isaiah said the Messiah would do. The lame are walking. Again, that had been prophesied. Those who have leprosy are cleansed. And Jesus is checking off all the prophecies that had been made about the Messiah. The deaf hear and the dead are raised. Check, check, check. And then he says, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. That again, it had been prophesied. So Jesus is saying, I'm fulfilling all the prophecies that have been made about me. What's your problem, John? And then he encouraged them by saying these words, verse 6. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. In other words, just because Jesus doesn't do everything that you want him to do. Have you ever prayed for something and the Lord said no, or maybe wait? Just because Jesus doesn't do everything you want him to do doesn't mean that Jesus isn't working, or that Jesus isn't who he said he is. The fact that Jesus isn't doing what you want him to do is simply indicating that you aren't God, and he is. That's all it indicates. So Jesus says to John's disciples that they're supposed to bring a message back to John and say, blessed is the one. It's a beatitude. Blessed is the one who does not stumble on account of me. In other words, Jesus is saying to John, don't get discouraged. Keep the faith. John was questioning it. I know I was told to announce you as the Messiah, but I don't know for sure if you really are. And Jesus said, don't get discouraged. Don't stumble. Don't deny me now. Keep the faith. So the disciples or the followers of John are heading back to John, who's in prison. They're heading back to John's prison cell to report what Jesus said in answer to John's question. And that's where we pick it up in chapter 11, verse 7 to 15. Jesus spoke to the crowd about John. First of all, Jesus is speaking to John's disciples, answering the question. Now he's speaking to the crowd around them who has heard the question, and now he's speaking to the crowd around them about John, whose disciples are walking away. So John's disciples were leaving, and Jesus begins to speak to the crowd about them. And this is the question he asked them. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? The crowd who is around Jesus is filled with people who have been watching John the Baptist's ministry. And Jesus knew it. So when they hear that John the Baptist is full of doubts, it's kind of like tearing at their hearts. And the crowd is looking to see what is Jesus going to do next. And Jesus looks at the crowd and he says, what was it that you went out to the wilderness to see? And he gives them three options. First of all, was it a reed swayed in the wind? In the area where Jesus was walking and living, I'm told that there were long 3 to 4 foot high reeds that would sway in the wind like this. And Jesus was asking the question, did you go out to see a preacher that did whatever was popular? Is that what you went out to see? And Jesus says, no, that's not what you went out to see. I know what John was doing. He was not a reed swayed by the wind. The second question is, what did you go out to see? Do you see him repeating the same question? A man dressed in fine clothes. Those people that I talked about earlier that are on TV and preach all kinds of health and wealth gospel, have you noticed the clothes that they wear? They wear very expensive suits and ties and shirts. They have very expensive buildings. They are flashy people because they want to look good on TV. And he says, did you go out to see a man dressed in fine clothes? And the answer, no. You would go to a palace to see a man dressed in fine clothes, but that's not what you went out to the wilderness to see. When you went out to the wilderness to see John the Baptist, you saw a rugged man dressed in wild clothing. Well, tell me, what did you go out to see? Did you go out to see a prophet? And a prophet is somebody who speaks on behalf of God. And Jesus said, yes. Jesus is giving a compliment to John the Baptist. Jesus is saying John the Baptist was a real prophet sent from God. And he goes even further. He said he was even more than a prophet. In what way was John the Baptist more than a prophet? John the Baptist was more than a prophet because he was the one to prepare the way for the Messiah, and he actually fulfilled prophecy by coming to prepare the way for the Messiah. And Jesus uses a quotation in verse, 10. He says, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you. And do you know where that's from? It's from the book of Malachi. The prophet Malachi was one of the last prophets to write before there was a period of 400 years of silence before John the Baptist came and then Jesus came. In fact, if you want to flip back, before the book of Matthew, the book of Malachi is the next book in front of it. Okay? It's right there. He's the last prophet that spoke before there was a 400-year silence, and then John and Jesus came. So he's talking very relatively recent history about the prophets. And he says, Jesus said, John the Baptist not only was a prophet, but he also fulfilled prophecy from Malachi. And then Jesus looks at the crowd and he has a word of affirmation for them. Look at verses 11 to 15. John was the greatest person physically born. Can you give anybody a better compliment than that? Look at what it says. Truly I tell you, that's Jesus' way of saying this is very important. Amen and amen. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, who's born of women? Anybody here not born from a woman? Then you're not a human being, right? Everyone here is born of a woman. Among those born of women, among all humans, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. John the Baptist was the greatest human being to ever live. That's what Jesus said. Wow. But then he goes on to say something else. He says, but the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater. Why? Because John the Baptist was born physically, and in order to get into the kingdom of heaven, you have to be born spiritually. Have you been born again? Have you been born into the family of God? Then you are greater than John the Baptist. That's what Jesus says. John the Baptist was the greatest ever born physically, but if you are born spiritually, then you're greater than John the Baptist. Wow. Then in verse 12, he goes on and says, there's an explanation. John initiated a new period of time. I don't want to use the word New Age because that's affiliated with other ways of thinking. But it's a new period of time. Until John the Baptist, there were prophets, and there was the law and the prophets. There was Moses and the prophets. And that was a specific period of time. But when John the Baptist came, John the Baptist started a new period of time. He was the last of the Old Testament prophets, but he was the first one in what Jesus calls the kingdom of heaven. And the kingdom of heaven was started by John the Baptist, and you and I are in it still today. The kingdom of heaven. That place where Jesus rules. So John initiated a new kingdom period. The kingdom of heaven is facing opposition. Now, there's a problem in the Greek text here, and I want to try to explain it. My NIV talks about verse 12 like this. It says, the kingdom of heaven has been subject to violence, and the violent people have been raiding it. Now, there are other translations that go a little bit different. In fact, you can see it in the NIV footnote. The NIV footnote says, you could also translate this, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing and violent people have been raiding it. Let me explain. There's a difference in understanding the word in Greek, and they're not quite sure where the violence is coming from. The violence isn't coming from Christians, the people of heaven, but they're not sure if the violence is directing at it, at the people in the kingdom of heaven, or if the quick advance of the kingdom is a spiritual violence against the kingdom of the devil. So there's a little conflict in understanding that passage. Whichever way it should be interpreted, and I personally think that the footnote is actually better. The kingdom of heaven has been advancing forcefully, and violent people have been raiding it. In other words, there were amazing strides that John the Baptist and Jesus have made. Thousands of people were listening to them. The kingdom of heaven was advancing, but at the same time as the kingdom of heaven was advancing, what was happening? John was put in prison. Jesus was facing opposition. Evil people had been raiding the kingdom of heaven. So the kingdom of heaven had been going forward, but there was opposition. Violent people were attacking it. And then, verses 13 and 14, Jesus said that John was the last of the Old Testament prophetic period. He was like Elijah who was to come. And again, you need to flip back in your Bible to the book immediately before Matthew. And you get to the book of Malachi, and guess what? In Malachi chapter 4 and verse 5, one of the last verses of the Old Testament, we read these words. This is a prophecy. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. Now, some people today have interpreted that verse to mean that Elijah is going to come at the end of time, like after the church. But what does Jesus say in this text? Jesus says if you accept it, John the Baptist is the fulfillment of this prophecy. John the Baptist was the prophet Elijah sent to you before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Well, then what's the great and terrible day of the Lord? Remember, Jesus is focusing on the people of Israel. Jesus is not yet saying it's for the whole world. He's focusing on the Jews and on the people of Israel. And what was the day of the Lord, the day of judgment for the people of Israel? In 70 AD, the city of Jerusalem was totally destroyed and the temple was destroyed. It was seen as the day that God judged Israel for their rejection of Jesus. And it was the day of the Lord for them. So, Jesus says that John the Baptist is the Elijah who is to come if you can accept it. In other words, if you are spiritually willing to listen to Jesus. And I hope we are. So he ends in verse 15 by saying, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. In other words, listen to me, please. If you got a physical ear, listen with your heart, not just your ears. By the way, that statement is repeated over and over and over again. And when you get to the book of Revelation, and John is writing to the 7 churches, he repeats this statement over and over again. He who has ears, let him hear. That's Jesus' way of saying, pay attention. Okay. So far, let me quickly review. We've talked about Jesus who spoke to the 12 disciples, the disciples of John, about John's ministry and about John's question. Then we talked about Jesus who spoke to the crowd about John. And now in verses 16 to 19, Jesus spoke to the crowd about their generation. And Jesus starts with a rhetorical question in verse 16. To what can I compare this generation? And he's not talking about our generation right now. He's talking about their generation at that time. He says, how can I explain how you folks are acting? To what can I compare this generation? What are these people like? And then Jesus answers his own question. He says, they are like children sitting in the marketplace. And he paints this picture of children in the public square, and these children are playing a game. And the game that they are playing is they're playing music for children to dance with. And have you ever seen children argue about what they're playing? I want to play this game. No, I don't feel like playing. I've seen that so many times. And Jesus is saying this generation of people that he was talking to and living with, these generation of people are like those kind of children. There are people that Jesus wanted to follow him, and Jesus wanted them to obey him, but they were like children calling out to one another in the city square. We're going to play the flute, and we want you to start dancing. And then they start playing the flute, but nobody danced. And then you get this thing. We are playing the pipe for you, but you did not dance. In other words, a joyful, happy tune. But you're not dancing. Why are you not? We don't want to play. And then he says, and then we went to the opposite extreme. We sang the dirge for you, and you did not mourn. Da 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 da. Sad funeral music. We sang that for you, but you didn't start crying. You're not playing our game. He says, this generation is like that. And then he uses two examples. He says, the first example is John the Baptist. Verse 18. John came neither eating nor drinking, and they said he had a demon. What was John not eating? He wasn't eating regular food. What was John not drinking? John was a Nazirite. He promised not to ever touch alcohol. So John wasn't feasting. He was eating, grasshoppers, locusts, and wild honey. He had a very meager wilderness diet. He wasn't eating a lot of food, and he wasn't drinking a lot of wine. He wasn't eating and he wasn't drinking. And what did people say when they saw John the Baptist? They said, he must be demonic. We don't like him. So then in verse 19, Jesus talks about himself. And Jesus often uses the words, the Son of Man, to talk about himself. And he says, the Son of Man came in a different way than John the Baptist did. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. Jesus ate with sinners. Jesus drank with sinners. Jesus was one to celebrate with the people. But what did they say about Jesus? He is a glutton. He eats way too much. And he's a drunkard. He drinks way too much. I don't think Jesus was ever a drunkard, but that's the reputation that people slanderously gave him. In other words, what Jesus is saying is God has given this generation, the people of Israel, in his time, every opportunity to come to God. He has given them the opportunity of John the Baptist. He has given them the opportunity of the Messiah. And in hearing John the Baptist and